Welcome everyone to another KSAA interview. We're bringing you recorded conversations with authors, scholars and curators, all organised by our Keats-Shelley Association of America Communications Fellows. Today, Communications Fellow Marianne Wassif will be interviewing Lauren Burke and Hannah Chapman of the podcast Bonnets at Dawn. They are also the authors of the really exciting new collection, Why She Wrote, illustrated by Kaley Bales. The book is a compelling graphic collection featuring 18 women, including Jane Austen, Louisa May Alcott, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Anne Lister, and more, and asks a simple question. In a time when being a woman writer often meant being undervalued, overlooked, or pigeonholed, why did she write? So I'll hand over to Mariam to interview them today. I'm a huge fan of this podcast myself, so I'm very excited for the chat. Links to the podcast and the Bonnets at Dawn Twitter page, as well as where you can buy the book, are all in the text under this video. But I'll just introduce you to Marianne first. Dr. Marianne Wassif received her PhD from Cornell University in 2018 with a specialisation in British and French literature of the long 18th century. She is currently a postdoc at the University of Paris, studying classical influence and notions of beauty, artifice and style in literature and material culture around 1800. And her book manuscript in progress is entitled Poisoned Vestments, Rhetoric and Material Culture in England and France, 1660 to 1820. And you can follow Mariam on Twitter too. Her handle is at Dr. Mariam Wassif. So Mariam, I'll hand over to you now to do the interview.
Okay. Thanks so much, Anna, for the introduction, and thanks very much, Lauren and Hannah, for making the time to talk to us today. I'll just briefly compliment Anna's introduction and then say a little bit more about the book and then ask a few questions. So Lauren Burke is a writer and podcaster from Chicago, Illinois, and her work focuses on women's history, writing, and travel. Hannah K. Chapman is a writer and podcaster living in Bristol, England. She co-hosts with Lauren Burke of the podcast Bonnets at Dawn, which Anna mentioned, and is the founder of the award-nominated anthology series Comic Book Slumber Party. The book is illustrated by Kaley Bales, who's an illustrator living on the California coasts. And you can subscribe to Bonnets at Dawn on SoundCloud, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And as Anna said, all that information will be in the text. So Lauren and Hannah are the authors of Why She Wrote, a graphic history of the lives, inspiration, and influence behind the pens of classic women writers, which is just out from Chronicle Books in April 2021. Illustrated, as I said, by Kaley Bales. So as the title indicates, the book is a graphic history of women writers, often using their own words. It cites, for instance, Mary Shelley's 1831 introduction to Frankenstein and Alice Dunbar Nelson's poem To Madame Curie. And I'll just read a couple of lines of the poem because I think it wonderfully encapsulates the project and goals of the book. So this is Alice Dunbar Nelson writing on Madame Curie. Oft have I thrilled at deeds of high emprise, and yearned to venture into realms unknown. Thrice blessed she, I deemed, whom God had shown how to achieve great deeds in woman's guise. The book is accessible and incredibly well researched. You don't have to bring a lot of prior knowledge to it, but if you do, it has so many fresh approaches, perspectives, and revealing anecdotes to offer. It's also funny and playful. So Lauren makes a cameo as a high school student. There are some tongue-in-cheek references to bonnets, such as Anne Lister scandalously refusing to wear one. There's a wonderfully endearing anecdote about Charlotte Bronte hiding from a visitor behind a curtain. And there are many fascinating connections between the writers that I wasn't aware of, such as the fact that Charlotte Bronte started to write a posthumously published novel called Emma, which is thought to have inspired Frances Hodgson Burnett's novel The Little Princess, or that Frances Harper named a character Jeanette Austen in homage to Jane Austen. And as Anna mentioned, the book is divided into 6 thematic chapters, each focusing on 3 women writers. It includes pages of text framing the graphic narratives and lists of selected works. So I'll just show off my copy here. Thanks very much to KSSA and Yasmin Salomonescu for obtaining a copy for me. It's very beautiful. And just as a material object, a delight to handle. And I'll now move on to my questions for Hannah and Lauren. The introduction contains an origin story for the podcast and the book. In a conversation over drinks, you talked about adulthood after college and how it left little time for talking about stories. You debated whether Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte was the queen of British literature. And eventually, through the podcast, you realized the lack of education in women's literature, the obstacles to writing that women face, and the way that women's art is rarely presented as deliberate. So can you tell us more about why you wrote this book, despite obstacles I imagine you faced, in its illustrated format? What did you hope to accomplish, and who was your audience?
Well, I will kick things off and first of all say, look at our glamorous podcast studio back here. Sorry, guys. So thank you so much for having us. First of all, this is amazing. I will just pipe in to say that I really wanted to work with Hannah on a project. We had kind of collaborated on things before, but we hadn't really worked directly on something. And so when we were kind of depressed in Angoulême and drinking a lot and talking about just classic literature and the way that, you know, we haven't been able to really connect to stories as professionals in our 20s, we were mostly just working with spreadsheets. We just wanted something to work on together and to collaborate together on. So that's how the podcast got started. And then I think from the book really naturally evolved from the podcast and from what we were learning and all of that good stuff. Chime in here, Hannah, make me sound smart.
So, actually, the book did evolve from the show, but I think our original pitch to Chronicle was like a reading journal. So it was like, it would be like Lauren and I were reading a book with you, so you could like respond to prompts and stuff, reading classic texts, and there would be fun facts about the author or the story. So I think you can start to see why she wrote in that concept, but it was like a really interactive book initially, and they were like, no, we don't want to make that book, but what else have you got? So then we kind of developed a book of essays which kind of fit with, you know, the format of the show. We write really long form notes, so I guess the basis of each episode of the show is almost an essay, a really unacademic essay. And then they were like, no, we don't want to publish that book. I think, I know you mentioned comic books Lumber Party in my bio, but Lauren also has a really like long relationship working in comics. She's written 2 really great series. One's called P.I. Jane, one's called I'm Not Omni Girl. She was involved in the Womanthology project. She was an editor for like Ladies Night anthology. I've been working in comics. I had been working in comics probably for about 10 years like 7 years when we started the show. And so it was really Julia, our editor, who was like, I don't understand why there are no comics in this book. Like, where are they? And I remember being like, I don't want to do that.
We were trying to pivot out of comics.
Yeah, we were like desperately trying to. It was always going to be illustrated. I think Kaley was involved in the project, even at the earliest stages when we were pitching this journal. And so when we started thinking about how would we pair essays, how would we pair comics, how would we break it down, we kind of came up with this long list of authors. And after we had the long list, we were like, okay, what are some of these stronger connections? And then the book got broken into the individual chapters. So there's 6 chapters and we each took 3 each. And yeah, it kind of went from there, really.
And the comics were nice because then we could really tell stories that we couldn't do on the podcast, right? Like, because, you know, we do try to get a sense of like who these people are and on the show, but it's different when you can see them and their facial expressions and their clothes and just really look at the time period.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, the audience of the book is an interesting one, because I was definitely writing the book for me as an adult in my late 20s who has an interest in like classics, biographical criticism and comics. And then the book is finished and they're like, we're going to pitch this to like children and libraries. And I was like, oh man, there's like Frances Burney, No, Frances Hodgson Burnett is like smoking, and I've got like this whole comic about having a breast cut off with no painkillers. And I was like, I don't know if kids are gonna like this book, but I hope they do.
Yeah, I think the comics really let you set up a very detailed scene and also do these moves backwards and forwards in time in really economical ways. I thought that worked really well. So many of the works you discussed are the results of a collaborative process. For instance, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and lots of others. So you touched on this a little bit just now, but what was the collaboration like for you two as authors working with an illustrator? How did the text and illustration influence one another?
I think the collaboration process was pretty easy on this because we're really used to, well, now especially we're on season 5 of the podcast, so we're really used to writing each other for our show notes. So Hannah can pretty much write in my voice and I can write in Hannah's voice. And what's nice about the book is that a lot of people who know us very well as writers can't tell who wrote what. So that's good. So we've really got that down, I think, at this point. And then also we're really used to, working with an artist and all that comes with that. So it was actually fairly easy. We kind of almost set up the chapters almost the way that we do the podcast, where Hannah and I sit down and we really talk about like our overall vision and goals and what we want to do. And then we kind of break things up and then go research things independently, but then it all goes back into the same Google Doc. And we're constantly sort of making notes or editing each other and constantly in conversation. So that's really nice. And then what's really lovely about comics, and this process actually made me go, oh, you know what? I do love comics. I do want to go back to comics, is that you have then like these conversations with the artists once you have a script, and they go and do like roughs. They do, sort of pencils and just, like almost storyboard out things a little bit. And then they come back to you and you're like, oh, okay. And it's so exciting. Like it gets you really excited to actually go on to the next step, which could be editing, or it could be like, that's great. That's perfect. Let's move on to the next author. So it was actually, I think, a fairly easy process. I think the hardest part was really getting the proposal where we wanted it to be, because there's so many moving parts, and you guys have described the book so well, because like every time I describe it, I feel like I'm describing one of Helena Bonham Carter's outfits. Like I'm like, well, there's fun facts and, there's a bibliography and there's so many different pieces, but just getting them all to be like cohesive, I think was the part that we were really worried about in the beginning.
Something that was really nice about working with Kaley as well is that we wrote the scripts entirely and then she would thumbnail them, and then we'd see the thumbnail, and then it kind of gives you an opportunity to write or edit. And I found definitely that those moments helped me really understand what I was trying to say, because if she'd misunderstood something I'd written and it wasn't translating, or if I hadn't written something or made it obvious enough, I'd see it not quite working on the page and I'd be like, this is the heart of the story, like this is the point, so we have to get that across. And then other things which maybe aren't as important and were just like a nice thing to have on the page, or something that I thought would be better than it was actually when you see it, it gave you an opportunity to like remove it. There were a few pages where I would just be like, remove half this page, like because the middle panel is the panel that actually, like, that's the point that I'm trying to make. And so with comics, you have like a thumbnail stage and a pencil stage and an ink stage and then a color stage and then a dialogue stage. And then you have a final edit. So that's just a lot of opportunities for Lauren and I to read our own work and read each other's work and just make sure that like it is definitely translating. And Kaley was really up for that. A lot of changes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
God bless her.
That is so fascinating, because I was very curious about this process and how it worked between the writers and the illustrator. And I think too, there's something radical in the act of collaboration. I especially love that you collaborated on this book about women writers, because I think the Western tradition is so focused on the model of the single individual genius, completely divorced from community. And so so much of, and academia is sort of like that too, although, like you said, it's so much harder to do work on your own, but sometimes it's so useful to have someone else translate your thoughts for you and sort of tell you what you're trying to say. So I think that's so important. Okay.
I'm glad that you said that too, because I will say about community, because that's sort of what the podcast is about. Like that's what we're trying to foster with the show. And that's something that's just super important to us. And I think that was maybe the biggest discovery that we made on the show when we were like examining women writers. Like we did think that they were all these just like sort of single geniuses, I think, going in. And then we're like, oh no, this is like, no one does it alone. Honestly, is the thing. So I think that was maybe one of the bigger discoveries of just like the show and the book.
Absolutely. And I think having the collaboration like front and center with everyone's names on it, because we know that these, white male writers had whole gangs of people behind them, making them potatoes or whatever it was needed to support their work. Right. I'm thinking of Dorothy Wordsworth's journals here, which is why potatoes occurred to me. So I love that the collaboration is really sort of valorized in your work. So speaking of collaboration, my next question is a rather long two-part question about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. So conveniently for us, the first chapter, tantalizingly titled The Horror of the Everyday, begins with the famous origin story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I'll just read the first couple of lines of the sort of background that you give. Mary Shelley is a legend, a woman so goth she carried around her dead husband's calcified heart until the day she died. She made a monster and a whole new literary genre. It's not just Frankenstein, it's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I love those lines.
Oh, thank you.
This section does a really wonderful job of economically establishing the peculiar climate in which Frankenstein came into being, influenced by the literal climate, of course, of the eruption of Tambora in 1815, which carried effects into 1816. The Diodati group's tumultuous personal lives, including tragic losses for Mary Shelley, and the rich intellectual environment of conversation and reading. The text uses her words from the 1831 introduction to Frankenstein to describe her creative process. So the first part of my question is, what did you want to emphasize about Mary Shelley's achievement? And the second part of my question has to do with the structure of the story. So it has sort of a filmic structure. It begins with world events and then zooms in, moving to this group of neighbors who are speculating about Byron's scandalous romantic proclivities. And then the section introduces Mary Shelley, but kind of makes her a background character before she really comes to the foreground as Frankenstein. So was this done deliberately, and what did you hope to show through these choices? So maybe you'd like to start with the first question. What did you want to emphasize about Mary Shelley's achievements?
Yes, this is an amazing question, actually. This is like the best question I've been asked, I think, about this book.
Oh, thank you.
So I will say, first of all, I'm responsible for the Mary Shelley bit. It's my fault. I did not want to write about the creation of Frankenstein. Like going in, I was like, I'm not going to write about that. No way. I really wanted to do something maybe more along the lines of Romantic Outlaws, which is a book that I love. And I wanted to compare and contrast Mary and Mary, mother and daughter. But then I was really sitting with it and I was like, oh my gosh, this book is about collaboration, right? So you can't get away from it, honestly. So then I kind of like sat down and like read so many children's books about Mary Shelley and watched the Doctor Who episode and Gothic and the Mary Shelley movie, all which sort of like tackle this night. And I think the main thing that I wanted to write about, what I wanted the reader to take away, was just about like what an extraordinary achievement this was and how it just felt very Mary Shelley. I think one thing that happens with this story is that it gets really taken away from Mary, which I kind of tackle a little bit in that comic with like the stage adaptations and the film adaptations. People, even people thinking that Percy wrote it, just all of these things, it gets taken away from Mary. But I wanted to say that this story felt very her. to me. So that was really what I wanted everyone to take away from that. But then also I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the like literary pressure that she was under, not only from her parents, but also just in that environment, in that creative environment with Byron and Shelley. And it really felt to me that it was very similar to the sort of literary pressure that Charlotte Bronte was under, and also the same sort of environment with her sisters in a way, which is why I put them next to each other in the book as well. So yeah, so those two things, I think, I was hoping to get across. We'll see. And then, yes, film-wise, yes. Okay, so I'm just like a frustrated like screenwriter that's never made it. So, yeah. So that's why. That's actually how I got into comics. As many years ago, I wrote a pilot, and it won like a competition, or it placed in a competition, and an agent contacted me and was like, "This is great. It seems very expensive. Like, you should make comic books. That's how your ideas are actually going to come across, because I don't know who's going to fund this." And I was like, great. So that's how I got into comics. And so when I write all of my scripts, I do like to think about them like a film. And also I love working with animators, and Kaley is an animator. So I really thought like sort of opening this up like a movie would be a great way to go. And then that ended up being, it wasn't always the first chapter, right, Hannah?
No, I feel like the second chapter, it was like Austen was going to kick it off, right?
Mm-hmm. Austen was going to kick it off. But then it moved to the first chapter because Julia was like, oh, this is such a good opening. And then, you know, Hannah and I have had this conversation before, how we sort of feel like the tourists who are like spying on Byron and Shelley from across the water. Like, that's like how we sort of feel about all of the women writers in this book, essentially. So we were like, yeah, this feels like a good way to sort of like just bring everyone very slowly into the story. And then also I do think Mary's a little distant in that book because, and you guys can chime in on this, Mary Shelley is really difficult, right? Like, she's kind of someone I didn't feel like she was like really accessible to me the way that some of the other women writers were. Like, her journals are quite tough, right? They don't really give you much. So yeah, I feel like when I was writing Mary, I just kept going like, who are you? Who are you? And my way into Mary, and you'll hear this in our episode on Mary Shelley with Fiona Sampson, is very much like through Charlotte Bronte, because I feel like they have some very interesting similarities. But I have no idea if I have the right read on her exactly. She does feel a little distant, but yeah, that's why she's kind of like sort of a background character. But also I think there's some strong like notes of emotion in that Shelley comic as well. So,
yeah, it was almost like a sort of visual version of free and direct discourse, where you're half sharing a consciousness with Mary Shelley as she's experiencing this environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you've done a lot of work on the Shelleys. Did you find Mary sort of hard to crack?
I think I was just going to say, I've read the Mary Shelley comic, and I think it does really encapsulate the different dynamics of the people working together, but also in kind of friendly competition with each other. And I really liked that. I thought it was fantastic, Lauren. And I suppose that is such an interesting point about Mary Shelley being kind of less accessible. And I think hopefully over the next few years, there'll be a bit more of a revival in Mary Shelley, like beyond her early stuff. And I really liked in your book how you have that great bit at the end of the Mary Shelley section that lists all the novels she published and how long that goes on after Frankenstein.
Yeah.
It's not, she didn't peak at 18, it kept going. So I loved it.
That was really important for us to have for all of the authors, those for some of them it's a complete bibliography, and for others it's like a selected bibliography, because they wrote like 50 novels and like 100 poems, and you can't list everything. And we are having like all of these back and forths. I know Lauren had them too, where you're like, which I've got a page, which of these do I include and like what's important, and just trying to like get a spread of what the authors have. But that's the exact point we were trying to hit. Like they didn't just write that one book you know them for.
Thank you so much for those responses. And so you've touched on this in speaking about Mary Shelley, and the way she was, the pressure that the environment exerted on her as coming up against these great men, Byron and Shelley. And one of the things I particularly appreciate about the book is its emphasis on the material conditions and constraints of writing for women. And I think this is especially the case in chapter 2, which is called Finding Their Voice, and is about Burney, Austen, and Gaskell. So the material conditions that are discussed range from the physical discomfort of sitting upright and tracing lines with pen and paper, to moving to a new city, for instance, Jane Austen being unhappy in Bath, or to the ever-present question of money, or in Fanny Burney's case, being stuck behind a military blockade in Napoleonic France and undergoing a mastectomy, which she details. Why was it important for you to highlight these material factors?
So when I started working on that chapter, I had like a really different idea of what I wanted to do with the authors and kind of what I wanted to say about them. And it was when I was researching Frances Burney, who I didn't know a lot about before we started. And I came across this really incredible essay by J.L. Epstein called Writing the Unspeakable, Fanny Burney's Mastectomy in the Fictive Body. And it kind of like details a really horrible history of mastectomies and the importance of the letter. And there was this one bit just about Frances Burney stitched the medical report that was written by a man to the letter she wrote of her personal account and sent it back to her sister. And I thought that moment of taking control of something that is really abhorrent and putting it into your own words and, you know, reclaiming your narrative really it was just such an interesting thing about her. And it's one of the earliest accounts from a patient getting a mastectomy. So that really kind of changed the direction I wanted to go in with those authors. And so trying to think about what some of the barriers might be. I remember I was sat at this table and I kind of sat in the chair and I was like, how do I feel? What's making me uncomfortable? And I was trying to like step back from myself and think about what they would have been going through. So like my chair wasn't super comfortable, but I have central heating and I'm not wearing a corset and, you know, all of these things. So I put myself a lot into the comic, and I feel like maybe people that know me, it comes through quite strongly. Like I have a really complicated relationship with Bath. I lived there for a time, like Austen. I worked at the Jane Austen Centre. I lost the use of one of my arms while writing, doing my master's, and then the Gaskell comic. I think we were kind of introduced to Gaskell through the Brontes, and I remember hearing about her really for the first time. Like I knew about Cranford, but I hadn't like watched the adaptation or read it or anything. And I just remember Lauren asking our friend Amy Rowbottom, just what's the deal with Gaskell and why do the Bronte scholars hate her so much? And talking about this book. And I think even that really tapped into, you know, here's Gaskell, who's a professional author and she's written a book, but then the response to the book is so strong that she has to completely rewrite it. And I think it was double the size by the time she finished addressing all of those concerns. And I related to her comic so much that during the process of writing it, and for a long time after we'd completed Why She Wrote, I was having all sorts of like anxiety dreams about our biography being wrong and having to rewrite it. So I found this chapter to be a really relatable thing. And it also makes me wonder, like, some of the similarities. Like there are still people who are trying to write through a time of war, there are still people trying to write who are going through physical discomfort, who don't have financial security, who are parents, mothers, primary caregivers, trying to like snatch moments in the day where they actually have time to sit and write. And so although their experiences are unique to them, I think a lot of people have done and will continue to go through really similar things. So I thought it was a really important story to tell, just about being a writer, and that it isn't all sunshine. You have to be pretty hardy to get through it. And I'm sure as academics as well, like, you've got to really push to get anything.
Yeah, we've like been through all of the experiences, I think, that everyone, not like with cancer, but I certainly, before we started writing this book, I actually had a stroke. And so I was recovering from my stroke as we were writing Why She Wrote. So the Bernie mastectomy letter was something that we discussed quite a bit. We discussed women's health and writing quite a bit behind the scenes, financial problems. I mean, our podcast, I thought like at the heart of it, it's about story, but also it's about money. Like so much of it is about money. We talk about money constantly on the show. And so we knew that like that had to come up in the book in many different ways, not just this chapter, but certainly in this one. And then Gaskell is the writer that I think about the most, like during my day, and all of her interruptions. If you go to the house, which we love Gaskell's house in Manchester, we call that the spiritual home of the show. There are like quotes up on the wall, like talking about how Gaskell was like constantly interrupted. And you can really feel it in that house where she wrote at the dining table, which is, not far from the front door, right next to the living room, which would have been really busy. And then like just across the way from William's study and next to the kitchen, like you just can feel like all of the sort of like activity that she was probably experiencing and constantly getting interrupted. And I feel that way as well in my daily life. So yeah, that chapter, love that chapter, Hannah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that chapter was really important for me as well. I think it goes back to what we were saying about collaboration and the way that we think about not just the author as this isolated being, but also the text as this isolated object, the new new criticism, well-wrought urn that's sort of divorced from the circumstances of its creation, which is, not the case. Those material circumstances definitely impinge on how a text is created. And just for me personally, I totally connect with what you were saying, because that chapter made me feel a lot less alone as an academic working and with lots of circumstances that don't show up in the work and in this sort of professional persona that you present. And so I really appreciate that. And so sometimes what I'm calling material factors include prejudices that make it particularly difficult for women from marginalized identities to flourish as writers. So for instance, Frances E.W. Harper's identity as both Black and a woman meant that she was left with nothing after her husband's death, and in her words, quote, did not feel as cleanly as others, that she had the same rights to battle injustice as white women. Meanwhile, the diarist Anne Lister used her journals to write in crypt everything that she couldn't say in public. And usually marginalized women not only face opposition in their lifetime, but they're then erased from the canon that most of us are taught. So was one of your goals in this book to broaden the public understanding of what makes a classic woman writer, in quotation marks? And how did you hope to do that?
I think short answer, yes, absolutely. I think that's like, we're constantly trying to sort of redefine that on the show. The subtitle for this book was really hard. And I think that we were trying to like cover so many time periods, right? And I remember we were like throwing the word classic around as we were like trying to come up with the subtitle. And I was like, oh, that word is kind of tough for me. But, it makes sense. People understand what it means. But I do think that we are constantly trying to expand upon it on the show, and expand the canon is like our goal. But yeah, Hannah,
Yeah.
it's 7 a.m.
It's all right, don't worry. So I think we make a point of saying it in the introduction and in the conclusion, maybe because it was a point of anxiety for us that we're not academics, and we're not trying to be the best or know the most. It's why we have a really long reference list at the end. But we do want Why She Wrote to feel like a starting point for readers who have maybe never heard of some of these authors. And I think what we're doing needs to be part of like a many-pronged attack, right? Okay. So it's like the pincer movement of redefining classics. I hope that someone would like read the book, find someone that they've not heard of, engage in their story, have like an appetite for their work and research about their work. And you kind of want to build up that critical mass because you want the readers to engage and seek them out. You want them to maybe move into like careers where they're researching or like talking about those people in new ways. You want the entertainment industry to be like, why is everyone talking about this person I've never heard of, and commission biopics and novels and TV series about them. Just to even include them in anthologies would be a helpful thing that we can do. So all of those things kind of have to happen at once. Like, it would be really nice if the next time someone sits down and is like, we should make a Jane Austen biopic, and they go, hey, why don't we make something about Edith Maude-Eaton, or just choose someone else? I don't know. Yeah. And like, I'm saying that as like a huge Austen fan, and I do find myself relating all of the authors I read to Austen because she is the most important author in my life. It's why I started the show with Lauren, but everything doesn't have to be about her. Like, I can make the comparison, but not only think about and read her work. And I do like to think that Why She Wrote and Bonnets at Dawn is just a part of that wider movement away from Jane Austen.
Includes Jane, but
it includes her. Don't exclude her, but like, it doesn't have to be like a party for one,
Right. And I should say too, like, we didn't think of this list as comprehensive as well. Like, we feel like this work is ongoing and there's still so many authors that we, want to talk about. And like Pauline Hawkins, I feel like we did some stuff with her last year, and we love Pauline Hawkins. And she's one of those authors that I was so mad when I found out about her, because I was like, why didn't we read any of her work in school? Like, this is wild to me. Why did I not hear about her until I was in my 30s? Like, why is like only one of her books in print, readily available? And so there's still authors like Pauline who we like really want to highlight and work with in some way. And hopefully in future work, we can do that.
It's funny, Pauline Hawkins is someone that comes up a lot. Like, Lauren and I talk about her all the time because I think she's like, I've got like an imaginary baton where like Bernie passes the phrase Pride and Prejudice to Austen, who inspires Gaskell to write North and South. And in my head, in my fantasy world, Pauline Hawkins read North and South and wrote Contending Forces. Like, it just makes sense. And I think often in a lot of the interviews and stuff we've done to promote Why She Wrote, there's almost like you want to apologize for having like a really limited experience or knowledge of authors. And I know that there have been a few times where Lauren's like, I'm so embarrassed that I didn't read this person until I was 30. But I don't think anyone needs to apologize for not reading someone like Pauline Hawkins if her work's not being adapted and it's not readily available in bookshops and it's not being discussed. How would anyone know? So I think it's nice that that so many people who just weren't available to us as children are available now to young people that are interested in the classics. I think that's really nice to like even see it in your own lifetime. How old do I sound? Like 30.
So speaking of the ongoing work, do you have any new writing projects in the planning stages? And what are you hoping to do next?
Oh gosh. Well, COVID has kind of taken us for a ride as with everyone else, of course. So there's nothing we can like announce, but I will say that we do have some stuff for the podcast that's definitely in the works for next year. So two things that I think might be of interest. One is a sort of season on abolition, which I'm really excited about. And we're finally going to tackle like Harriet Beecher Stowe in depth, which if you listen to the show, Harriet Beecher Stowe like haunts the show because she's involved with everyone in some way. She's just like running in the background of like everyone's story. And a lot of people are actually surprised that she wasn't in Why She Wrote, because she, more so than anyone else, I think, is like connected to like almost everyone in the book. But it's because there's just like, it would be too much Harriet. It would have to be a Harriet focused book. And then the other thing is that we are definitely like not finished with Dorothy Wordsworth, and we have to go to Newstead Abbey. That's on our to-do list as well. So we are planning like a return to the lakes, back to the lakes, unfinished business at the lakes. Is that what we're doing? Yeah.
Like the sequel to Lake Placid. That's all we are.
Yeah, that's where we are.
Love that one. I will say too, we have an essay in an upcoming book edited by Kerry Sinanen and Anika Bounce called Austen After 200, and we wrote about Mr. Collins, and that was just announced recently, and it was really fun to work on that. So that will be out at some point.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that too. I mentioned to Lauren last time that I've also got an essay.
Oh, you do? Yeah.
Yeah, about Emma. So I'm excited to appear alongside you guys. I felt a little bit bad about this last question because I feel like it happens to academics too, where as soon as you finish something, people are like, so what's next? You just like want to bask in the finishedness of what you've done.
We always have something sort of like in the works.
Yeah.
Yeah, baking in the oven.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing those upcoming projects. I'm really excited about those things, to read your essay about Mr. Collins and to see your work when you go back to the Lake District. So thanks very much for talking to us today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you guys. Yeah, this was great. I'm like, I hope it makes sense. It was really early for me, but thank you guys so much for having us. This was super fun. And I hope to like get a drink with you guys sometime soon when we return to England, when I return to England.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was such a fascinating discussion. I just loved the celebrations of women and community and collaboration and books. It was just fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much, Lauren and Hannah and Marianne, for great questions.